Good morning. We heard this morning from some of the lions of OER, Dr. McIntosh at a global level, and our own Vice-Chancellor, who, as he said, was instrumental in introducing OER to the region. Now you get to hear from one of the fleas. I don't present myself as an expert on OER, in fact, quite the opposite. Although I've benefited from open educational resources at various stages of my academic career, as a term, OER is relatively new to me. And in fact, I've only consciously paid attention to OER as a term since the university, since I joined USP, and since the university began to push it for our courses and programs. Now, when all of us are so busy, we can tend to be wary of suggestions that come to us from above and assume that it's going to mean more work for us. But in this case, I don't think that's true. And in fact, I think that OER, if used in the right way, can save us a lot of time, particularly when it comes to writing and to revising our courses. So I'm not standing up as an expert. I'm operating at a very basic level, as you'll see. And I'm sure many of you know more about OER than I do. What I wanted to do is just share my experience, my limited experience, of how OER have helped me within my own courses and within my own teaching, really just in case there's anybody who's still wary of the term or wary of the idea that we might have to implement OER into our teaching. Now, most of us are already familiar with using open access material in our day-to-day lives, even if that's just at the level of using Wikipedia. And I gather that OER operates on a similar principle, with the understanding that key teaching and learning resources should be freely available for all and freely accessible. Now, there are some big claims made about the nature and the philosophy of OER, with some claiming that it will transform the very nature of education, democratizing education and making it available for all. Now, however wary we may be of big claims, this is of obvious appeal to us at USP and in the Pacific generally. So to follow Ernest's mother's advice, I'll just give 3 reasons that came to mind when I was thinking about why OER is obviously helpful to us at USP. To begin with, it's cheap for us to implement, and cheap for the students, which, as we've again just heard, is useful for the students as well as us. It's readily available, so we don't have to wait months anymore for books to arrive in the book center or into the library. And it's easily incorporated into online delivery. And as all of us know, that's the direction the university is going. The easier it is for us to incorporate material into our online courses, the easier that job will be for us. Now, like anything, I think that OER as a practice has its limitations. And at the end of the talk, I'll briefly reflect on those limitations for us here in the Pacific and some possible ways around it for us as educators in the Pacific. But first, I just thought I'd present my own experience at USP as a kind of case study to show that OER can be valuable for us here in our day-to-day teaching. Now, there are many, many resources available, and one of the resources that has helped me a lot is this one, OER Commons. Now, it's quite an amazing website, whatever your discipline, and it's easy to navigate. If you have a look on OER Commons, you'll see that you can freely access and adapt basically everything that you could need for your teaching, from full courses to assignment ideas and rubrics and instructions, to full lectures and lecture notes, lesson plans, modules, primary resources, reading lists and syllabi, class activities, textbook material, and much more. Basically, anything you could think of that might be helpful for your teaching, you can find on this website. And I'm sure there's many other repositories that have a similar scope. It also gives accessible templates for developing your own courses, which can then be shared through this website as well. Now, the website's easy to navigate, and it allows you to search by subject area, by keyword, by level of restriction, so whether it's completely open whether there's partial restrictions or whether there's copyright. And I have to say, I haven't tried to use it to build whole courses, and I still do this the old-fashioned way, building from the ground up. But I have found it very useful in finding particular parts to use within those courses, and especially when undertaking online conversion. Another great archive for us in literary studies is Project Gutenberg. Now, this is a pretty old website. It includes thousands upon thousands of mostly out of copyright texts in any format that you might want. And this has helped me and my students many times, particularly when it's hard to access a book or when it's slow arriving. You can very often, if it's out of copyright, and us in literary studies, we still are interested in books that are out of copyright, almost anything you can find here. And it's freely available for us and for the students. Now, it's obviously excellent for literary studies where we look at these old books, but I think this repository would be useful for other disciplines also. For history, for example, there's countless historical sources on the Pacific, which, even if they're only the targets for us to then take down on these European historical works on the Pacific, can still be very valuable in our courses and in our teaching. There's also a lot of early scientific or pseudoscientific work on the Pacific also. So I can see that these would be useful for other disciplines. For us in literature, it's extremely helpful. Now, even using just these two websites, you could get close to building whole programs for free. And there are countless other resources too, many of which are quite easy to find online. In my case, I think that the main obstacle to using OER wasn't a limitation of material, but in fact that there was too much material and not enough time to properly filter and sort through this material before we begin integrating it into our courses. And that may be similar for others as well. But if you see OER not as a box-ticking exercise that you have to do on top of your normal workload, and instead as a tool that it's worth investing the time into learning to use, I think it can actually help us lighten our workloads, particularly, as I say, when it comes to online conversions and that kind of thing. Now, in my case, it also helped me improve my teaching. This is a really small-scale example, but I just wanted to share this one to show that these big systems can be useful for us on a day-to-day basis. So it's often said that people teach in the way that they were taught, and that was certainly the case for me. I was taught in a seminar system where we as students would attend lectures and then have small seminars of 6 to 10 students where we would then discuss these ideas, discuss the ideas that we had heard in the lecture, discuss the text that we were studying. And in this method, the tutor guides the discussion, but they're primarily student-led. It's primarily the students who do the talking with the tutor who occasionally guides the discussion if it goes very far off topic. Now, I carried this method with me at each of the 4 universities I taught at in England, and it mostly worked so long as the class size remained manageable. When I got to USP 5 years ago, I quickly found that the method wasn't instantly transferable. Although our students here are very good talkers in certain contexts, too good sometimes, when they're sat down in front of the lecturer, they can sometimes be reluctant to voice their opinions and are often more used to sitting and listening than they are to talking, especially if they're in a group of 20 or more. Now, I don't know if this passive listening model works for other disciplines, but for literature it certainly doesn't. And by the sounds of things, for politics it wouldn't either. Because almost the sole core purpose of literary studies is to develop our students as independent critical thinkers, as students who can debate and discuss an idea and form their own opinions on that matter. And that can't be done passively. That can't be done just by listening. At the same time, the constructive model, where students develop knowledge by debating and discussing these ideas for themselves, it can't be forced. And I'm sure all of us as teachers have had experiences where you're in the classroom and you're trying to get a discussion going, and the students just sit there like that, and it gets harder and harder to keep it going, to try and keep the ball up in the air. Everyone, I'm sure, can relate to that feeling. Now, if students are shy or underconfident, or if they're just not used to voicing their own opinions, to criticizing or to critiquing the ideas put forward by the lecturer, then this constructive talking model, it can't work, and the students basically cannot fulfill the graduate outcomes for literature. So for a while, when I arrived, I just tried to keep pushing the way that I was, and just kept trying to push students harder and harder to talk within the tutorials. When you're already very busy, it's difficult to redesign tutorial activities. And anyway, I didn't know where to start. So I turned to the Higher Education Academy's Knowledge Hub, which includes a whole lot of discipline-specific OER teaching resources. Now, what I did with the Knowledge Hub is look through different tutorial activity ideas. And for each tutorial, I adapted a different activity from this website, using it as the starting point. And there are various ideas that I adapted, some of which were quite innovative. So, for example, one of the ideas I got from here was to have a tutorial activity where at the start of the tutorial, 2 small groups of students will stand at 2 separate corners of the room, and then they will debate a set topic, and they have to persuade, in turn, each of the students in the room to get up and join one or the other teams. And then when the student gets up and joins that particular team, they then join the conversation and have to persuade the next one to come and join their team, not the other one. Now that was a very useful activity, not least because it meant that every single student, however shy or reluctant they were, had to choose a side and had to then voice their own opinions to the rest of the group. So each week I tried a different one of these activities that I developed from Knowledge Hub, and some worked better than others, some were hopeless, and some, like that one, were interesting and useful. Now, what I found doing this is that by halfway through the semester, the students were so used to expressing themselves and to realizing that they don't have to take everything that I say as sacred. They were so used to expressing themselves to me and to the other students in the room that the more traditional discussion method that I tried to implement in the first place took off, because they felt able to express their opinions, and so with a bit of prodding and nudging from me, good discussions would get going. And by the end of the semester, I was teaching in more or less the same way that I used to. And it seems to have worked. The student feedback has got better and better, and several students have particularly praised the tutorial activities themselves. And the pass rates have gone up as well. I'm embarrassed to say how much they've gone up by, because I don't want to make it sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but they've gone up anyway. They've gone up considerably. I've also made use of this OER material in designing online activities, and there are, again, countless different ideas that you can use. We don't have time for me to go through any specific examples, but if anybody is interested and would like me to share the material that I've used and adapted, I'd be very glad to do that. Although there continue to be challenges to our online teaching, some of which you've probably heard me speaking about before, again, within my online courses, the pass rates and the student feedback have gone right up also. Now, I'm not giving these stats, these examples to say that there's anything particularly special about my teaching. I don't see myself as a naturally gifted teacher, but rather just to show that being open to using other material from elsewhere and to taking ideas from elsewhere can help us continually improve our teaching practices. So although it took a bit longer when I first started, it took a bit longer for me to find the material, actually it's made my daily teaching life much easier than it was before, and there's far less remedial work to be done later in the course. I should also acknowledge that many of you are far more experienced teachers than me, and many are far more closely tuned to which teaching methods work for our students here in the Pacific. And many of you have no doubt developed your own equally effective techniques. Much of what I introduced from OER might be similar to what you were already doing. But for me, having identifiable and citable repositories and archives can nevertheless be useful, both for validating our current techniques and for giving new ideas. Okay, just to finish off, as valuable as I think that these tools have been, and I must stress that I'm a low-end user, but as valuable as they've been to me, I think that OER is not without its risks or without its limitations. To begin with, it requires good online access, which is by no means a given across the Pacific, even for students who we've accepted onto our online courses. So when I heard in Dr. McIntosh's talk earlier about the Reveal.js application, I mean, that's something very interesting. If there's an application that means students can access material without a particularly good online access, then that's something that would be very useful for us. Secondly, OER requires, for us at the moment, incorporating it into our courses, it requires active quality control. So our students rely upon our guidance and discernment, as they may not be able to tell by themselves what material is reliable and what material is suitable for their purposes. Thirdly, a risk of OER can, I think, be used as an administrative excuse for not investing in important resources. So closed access material is an obvious example, but also course development staff. And I say this not just as a lecturer who would prefer to keep my job even as we move into online teaching, but also as someone who firmly believes that tertiary education should primarily be research-driven. And in my limited experience, not all of the material available through OER is at the very cutting edge of research, although much of it no doubt is. Now, these three limitations, access, discernment, and administration and resources, are surmountable as technology in the Pacific continues to develop, and so long as the university continues to support quality research and resources. But there is one other set of questions that I think we should ask as we begin seriously using OER. Who has developed the resources that we are using, and whose perspectives do they reflect? And whose perspectives do they exclude? At present, most OERs are not produced in the Pacific, and some may promote values and pedagogies that do not correspond with our values and pedagogies here in the Pacific. At best, this makes some material inappropriate for our use and for our students, and at worst, it could be seen as without wanting to get too political, a soft form of neo-colonialism, with the overwriting of indigenous methods and modes with other falsely neutral systems of knowledge. This perhaps isn't such a problem with, say, statistics, which I suppose should be taught in a similar way wherever you are in the world. But it is a problem with, say, literature or history, which are still deeply Eurocentric disciplines and the sites of ongoing contest for post-colonial scholars in regions such as ours. Now again, I don't see this as an insurmountable problem, but I think it reminds us that we should treat OER as a starting point rather than an end in itself, and continue to invest in scholars who can adapt this material to Pacific needs. Overall, I believe that OER, the advantages of OER outweigh the risks, and whatever our feelings might be, that's the way the tide is turning, and we may as well swim with it rather than against it. In my experience, it has been a great help for me and I think for my students. At USP, most of us are for now more likely to be consumers of OER than producers, at least in the short term. But I think we can maintain our agency as producers, so long as we do not accept material unreflectively and instead work to adapt them to suit our own needs here in the Pacific. If in the process we can build into the courses and activities substantial and irreducible Pacific content, we are effectively producing new material. And this ties in with what the VC was saying about ensuring that USP continues to know best how Pacific Island students think and learn. And it's possible that the resources we then develop may then be of use to others outside of the region, particularly the Pacific diaspora. I suppose that's the ideal principle for OER and for open educational practices generally, to make education a collaborative process in which knowledge is not passed on in a static form, but is something that's continually developed to suit the varying needs of people all over the world. As utopian as that may sound, in principle, that's something that I can very much get behind. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matthew. It was really a very interesting perspective, and for someone that purports to be a novice in the area of OER, based on your insights and your thinking, I'm not sure I agree with you, but I think it's really interesting. I really appreciate it. The issue you raised, you talked about equity essentially, and who writes history, as I sort of alluded to in the previous comment I made after the previous speaker. It just reminded me of what Wayne mentioned in his talk about something of the order of 100 million people who are not really in a position to get access to education. I think a lot of the political disputes and insurgencies and various disagreements, a lot of these I think have their roots in equity, and I think so that's a particularly important point that you made there as well. And you also made a really critical point, I think, around the notion that so much material is out there that it's overwhelming, and that is a feature of the web, as I'm sure we all appreciate. But the notion that someone needs to be critical of that, and I think that again fitted in nicely with our previous speaker who mentioned about how you get broader perspective by getting different perspectives rather than a singular thing if we're driven by sole textbooks for courses and things as well. So that's particularly helpful, particularly interesting, so thanks very much for your contribution there.